When you go to preacher's school, they tell you the worst sin you can ever commit is to apologize at the beginning of your sermon. I'm going to apologize. It is my fault that one of the songs was not inclusified. It was one of those things where the ones I typed, I checked. The ones I didn't type, but you know, the cut and paste, it's almost as good as autocorrect. I just assumed that we'd already done it. And you know what assuming makes. So here I am. My apologies. Our fellowship, thank you. Our fellowship works hard to inclusify music and words so that hurts are not magnified, and so that we welcome people of all faiths and beliefs to the fellowship of God in this place. So that was my mistake, not the praise teams, and thank you for accepting my apology. Does that make me not a you know what? In 3 weeks, we will celebrate the 34th anniversary of this church. Now, the general pastoral plan before an event such as this is to preach sermons with a pre-anniversary motivational motif. But this year, the lectionary didn't seem to cooperate. The Old Testament passage is about Moses striking a rock with his staff to get water for a bunch of whining, complaining ingrates. That certainly doesn't apply to this church. And the New Testament story is a real-life parable about children and their response to parental requests. Now, looking deeper, the Old Testament passage does deal with God's unfailing provision for God's people. Thirsty and far from home, God produced water where there was none. And you know, people faced with difficulties react in different ways. Some are strong. Some complain. Some reach out to help others. Some become heroes and some become thieves, as we've seen in the looting during some of our national disasters. Throughout the life of this church, we faced difficulties, we faced prejudice, and we faced fear. And throughout our history, people have acted accordingly as people. But God has always provided just what we needed when it was needed. I was beginning to think that I'd found the sermon theme for the New Testament passage. Kept nagging at my heart. If we're honest about it, we have to admit that just about the only place that we feel comfortable making bold statements about our religion and our allegiance to God is in church on Sunday mornings. In our hymns, we sing, "All to Jesus I surrender, all to Him I freely give." In our confessions of faith, we say, "I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah of God." And when we pray the prayer that Jesus taught His disciples to pray, we say, "Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." But how do our Sunday morning promises play out on Monday morning? All too often, those verbal commitments we make through hymns and prayers and confessions of faith really don't change anything about the way we live. And yet, we leave church on Sunday mornings feeling good about ourselves, having managed somehow to make it through another worship service, believing that our very presence here communicates to God our desire to be loyal children. Now, the text in Matthew is about integrity. What we do needs to match what we say. When our Monday morning faith appears to be totally unrelated to our Sunday morning affirmations, people in our community have to wonder if that kind of faith would make any difference in their lives. Parables like the one that Jesus told in our text for today tend to make us uncomfortable. At least it does me. A parable, if we allow it to work, can shock us into changing the way that we look at life. There's a book about parables of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew entitled The Divine Trap. The bait in the parable is the initial impression we have that this story is about someone else. So we sniff eagerly and we follow the bait. And then all of a sudden, the trap springs, and we discover that the story is not about someone else after all. It's about us. So look again at today's parable. A father had 2 sons, and he said to them, "Come help me with the harvest." First son said, "Sure, Dad, be right there." And then he kicked back on the couch, tuned in the football games, got involved with his handheld video games, and forgot all about helping with the harvest. The second son said, No way, Dad, not today. Things to do, people to see." But later, for some unknown reason, he changed his mind. And he decided that helping his father was more important than whatever else he planned to do that day. And this is a critical parable for us to look at as we look back over our past history and forward to the future of ourselves as a church. It's important because we are the ones who said, "Yes, Dad, I'll go help." There was a time when each of us received Christian baptism. There was a time when we stood at the front of the church and took vows of church membership, to uphold the church with our prayers, to be regular in our attendance, to be generous with our gifts and our service. We have been saying, "Yes, God, we'll help," here at Exodus for 34 years. It's an ice skating rink in Rockefeller Center in New York City. A few years ago, in the center of the rink, there was a lovely blonde woman in an attractive skater's outfit. The woman was stretching and posing, preparing, it seemed, to skate. Day after day, she returned to the rink, always dressed like a professional skater. But she spent lots of time doing skaters' poses. But she never skated. She was all appearance and no substance. Now, for many of us, that's all too close to home. We may look like followers of Jesus. We may even talk like followers of Jesus. But deep in our hearts, we know that what we're doing is stretching and posing. And when pastors are asked how they think their church will be rated if Christ came home today, 53% said their church would be rated as having little or no positive impact on souls or society. Are we having an impact on our community? Do our vows mean something, or are we content to sit and enjoy what we have and protect it at all costs? Now, to be honest, I can proudly say that I believe that this church has had a unique and purposeful impact on this city and the world. I have spent the last 3 days working with the church video. And sometimes I just have to sit back and watch the buttons stretch on the front of my shirt. I'm so proud of this church. Lots of good deeds done with what we have. Minds changed by interaction with folks and by example. Even love returned in the face of hate. And then as my buttons kind of lose their stretch, my comment is like the soldier in Saving Private Ryan. Tell me that God's pleased with the work we've done. Talk is cheap. Action is what counts. And I don't mean that we're supposed to keep busy for the sake of keeping busy. There are all too many churches like that. They have a terrific calendar of activities, but very few of those activities are meaningful in bringing people closer to God. We're not the French Foreign Legion, when in doubt, gallop. Jesus means for us to give witness to our inner experience through outward service. A wise old preacher told me a long time ago that churches that grow look outward, not inward. The Good Samaritan wasn't good because he studied the Bible, as important as that is, but because he saw a stranger in need and went to his aid. The rich young ruler missed out, not because he was immoral. He had kept the commandments religiously from the time he was a child. He missed out because he wasn't willing to give of his possessions to the poor and follow Jesus. The man who built his life on the rock was praised, not because he had the right theology, but because he heard Christ's words and did them. Some theologians define a good sermon as one that helps us think about things in a new way. Now that sounds okay on the surface, but the more I think about preaching, the less I find myself in agreement with that definition. Thinking about things in a new way is the way we love to deal with theology. To turn ideas over in our mind and then go out and have a good lunch and forget all about it. We think, we may even feel, but we're not moved to act. A good sermon ought to help us live in a new way. As a preacher, my task is not to be interesting or informative, amusing or entertaining. Now, I would hope that my sermons contain some of those things from time to time. None of these things, as desirable as they may be, amount to anything unless I can convince all of us to act, to allow the Spirit of God to transform us into a new creation. Hearers must become doers. Now here's the asterisk of today's sermon. There are times, like in the Old Testament, when God meets our needs to be comforted and strengthened. But there are also times when God knows that our greater need is to have our thinking challenged, our faith examined, and the way that we live called into question. Let me say this as clearly as I can. Jesus was not a philosopher who came to lay out a new system of disembodied beliefs for us to believe. Jesus was a teacher, and his textbook was his life. when we identify ourselves as Christians, we're not making a commitment to accept the dogma and the doctrine of a religious establishment. We're making a commitment to love and follow Jesus. Not simply because of what he said, but because of what he did, is doing, and will do for those who accept his invitation to come and work in the harvest. We have embarked on a lifelong journey toward the ultimate truth and a way of life like none other. Hearing is important. That's why I'm in the pulpit every Sunday morning. But hearing is in vain without doing. Believing is important. But the scriptures tell us that the demons believe and tremble. Or as James puts it, faith without works is dead. We've not been called to be pious saints sitting in the corner with our hands folded in complacent contemplation. We're called to be soldiers in the army of Christ. And Jesus this morning might say to us the same words George Washington used when he spoke to a complimentary civilian during the Revolutionary War. He said, "If you believe in me and my cause, then you'll join the army, you'll put on a uniform, you'll get yourself a rifle, and you will fight." And if we believe in Christ and the cause for which Christ died, we take up our crosses, we walk in his footsteps, and we do the same things that Christ would do if he were here in the flesh today, because he is. He is in each one of us. Now there's a story that some of you will remember in these 17 years I've been with you. It came out of the Second World War and it haunts me. So I'm going to tell you again and let it haunt you. A Jewish boy was living in a Polish village and he was rounded up with other Jews by Nazi troops and sentenced to death. They were forced to dig their own graves, lined up against the wall and shot. Miraculously, none of the bullets hit the little boy, but he fell into the ditch and pretended to be dead. Several hours later, he crawled out of his grave and made his way to the nearest home and begged for help. Fear caused the family to turn him away. Dirty, bloody, shivering from shock, he limped from one house to the next, begging for help. He always got the same response. People were afraid and refused to help. And finally, he knocked on a door, and just before the lady of the house could tell him to leave, he cried out, "Don't you recognize me? I'm the Jesus you say you love." We have a right to be proud of ourselves for the accomplishments of these last 34 years. God has done great things in us and in this place. But the fields are still white unto harvest. And Jesus calls us to help him in the field. And we promised we would. In our next 34 years, may it be said that we are a people of integrity. Our actions match our words, and that we recognize in all of the people we meet the Jesus we say we love.